The dark blue Nissan Rogue sat outside the showroom window with a silver bow stretched across its hood. Beside my hand was an envelope containing a cashier's check for the full purchase price. Across from me, the finance manager had just placed the first document in front of my wife, Maria. All she needed to do was review the final numbers, provide her insurance information, and sign the paperwork that would put the Rogue in her name. Her phone vibrated. Maria glanced at the screen, and a smile touched the corner of her mouth. It was the kind of smile I had not seen aimed at me in months. She looked at the vehicle I had spent 18 months saving for. "You really didn't need to bother," she said. "Darren is buying me a Mercedes next week. You can keep your cheap Nissan." Darren was her ex-boyfriend. Maria did not laugh or soften the sentence afterward. She said it like she was correcting an embarrassing misunderstanding. The finance manager froze with his pen above the desk. A salesperson nearby turned his head. I looked through the showroom and noticed a woman sitting at another desk with a young boy. I had seen them there the previous week. She was staring down at another set of numbers that clearly did not work. I turned back to Maria. "Perfect," I said. She gave a small shrug, convinced I had finally accepted that my gift could not compete with whatever Darren had promised her. I slid the unsigned document back toward the finance manager. "Since nothing has been signed," I asked, "can this transaction be canceled?" His eyes moved from me to Maria, then to the cashier's check. "I need to get our general manager." That was when Maria finally stopped smiling. 18 months earlier, I had believed the biggest problem in our marriage was an aging sedan. Maria's car was 13 years old. It had warning lights that appeared without explanation, a starter that hesitated on cold mornings, and an engine that sometimes stalled when she stopped at traffic lights. She hated it. I understood why. Nobody enjoyed wondering whether a car would survive the morning commute. What bothered me was that reliability was no longer Maria's only concern. She worked as an assistant manager at a large department store in an Omaha mall. Her days were spent around jewelry counters, designer clothes, expensive cosmetics, and customers who treated a $1,000 handbag like an ordinary Tuesday purchase. Several of her coworkers drove new SUVs or leased luxury cars. Maria began parking at the far end of the employee lot. "I don't want customers seeing me get into that thing," she told me one evening. I agreed that we needed to replace it. Maria assumed that meant walking into a dealership, choosing whatever impressed her, and adding another monthly payment to our household expenses. I had a different idea. I was 38 and supervised the receiving and delivery crews for a regional appliance distributor. My job involved damaged refrigerators, late trucks, missed deliveries, scheduling problems, and workers calling in sick 10 minutes before a shift. It paid steadily, but nobody would have mistaken me for wealthy. I was simply careful. I read contracts, I kept receipts, I avoided loans when I could. Before buying something expensive, I preferred knowing where every dollar would come from. So I began building a replacement car fund. I took weekend shifts during inventory counts. I saved 2 annual performance bonuses. I stopped ordering lunch at work and packed food from home. I postponed replacing my old television and abandoned the idea of buying a new fishing kayak. For 18 months, I moved every spare dollar into the account. I never touched our emergency fund. I never borrowed against my retirement savings. Maria knew I was researching cars, but I did not tell her how much I had saved. I wanted the finished purchase to be a surprise. My plan was simple: hand my wife the keys to something safe, comfortable, and fully paid for. I thought the absence of a monthly payment would mean more than the emblem on the hood. During those same 18 months, another name slowly became part of nearly every disagreement we had: Darren Walsh. Maria had dated Darren before we met. According to the version of their relationship she gave me early in our marriage, he had been exciting, ambitious, and completely unreliable. For years, she rarely mentioned him. Then his name began appearing at dinner. Darren had received another promotion. Darren had stayed at a resort near the lake. Darren had leased a new vehicle. Darren had renovated his house. Darren had taken clients to a restaurant where the steaks cost more than our weekly grocery bill. He worked as a district manager for a chain of wireless phone stores. He earned decent money, but his social media suggested a life several income brackets above that. His photographs showed leased cars, hotel balconies, restaurant tables, and lake weekends. The pictures were always framed carefully enough that you could never tell who else was present or who had paid. Maria never said she regretted marrying me. She did something more difficult to challenge. She placed Darren's choices beside mine and waited for the comparison to do the damage. When I repaired our backyard fence myself, she said Darren would have hired a contractor. When I suggested a weekend trip to Kansas City, she reminded me that Darren had recently flown to Miami. When I said replacing our aging furnace mattered more than remodeling a kitchen that still functioned perfectly, she said, "Some people understand that success is supposed to be enjoyed." Every comment carried the same message. Darren represented ambition. I represented settling. One evening, we were eating dinner when Maria's phone lit up beside her plate. I saw Darren's name before she turned the screen face down. "Why is your ex texting you?" I asked. "He's helping one of my coworkers change phone providers." It was possible. His company sold phone plans. Still, Maria answered too quickly. Over the following months, she began stepping onto the back porch to take certain calls. Sometimes she shut herself in the laundry room. If I entered while she was texting, the screen went dark. I noticed every time. I also kept talking myself out of what the pattern might mean. I had no proof of a physical affair. Maria had once described Darren as someone who made exciting promises and disappeared when responsibility arrived. I convinced myself she would never risk a stable marriage for a man she did not trust. That assumption cost me more than the car ever did. 2 weeks before the dealership scene, Maria's sedan finally gave up. The transmission failed during her morning commute. She managed to pull into a grocery store parking lot, but the repair estimate came back several $1,000s higher than the car's value. Maria approved selling it to a salvage buyer. She signed over the title, accepted the small payment, and deposited the money into her personal account. That left her with no backup vehicle. For the next 2 weeks, I drove her when my schedule allowed. Her coworkers gave her rides. On other days, she paid for ride shares. Her transportation problem was immediate and expensive. I assumed that would make a reliable, paid-off vehicle feel like freedom. I chose a 2-year-old certified pre-owned Nissan Rogue. It had low mileage, heated seats, a power liftgate, safety cameras, a clean inspection report, and part of its factory-backed warranty remaining. The price came in slightly below what I had saved. I placed a refundable holding deposit, arranged for a cashier's check covering the full out-the-door amount, and scheduled the final appointment for Saturday afternoon. The vehicle was not mine yet. Because I wanted it registered in Maria's name, she needed to be present with her identification and insurance information. Until she signed, the dealership still owned it. A week before the planned surprise, I went to the dealership alone to inspect the Rogue and review the preliminary figures. That was where I first saw Dana Rios and her 8-year-old son, Eli. Dana was seated at the next desk, wearing black work shoes and a navy jacket with the local school district's logo stitched near the shoulder. Eli sat beside her, coloring in an activity book. She was trying to buy a compact sedan. I did not mean to listen, but the desks were close. Dana was the lead cook at a public middle school. The district had offered her a better-paying relief kitchen manager position covering 2 campuses. She would have to travel between the schools during the day, so reliable transportation was required. Her old car had failed before she could accept the job. She had steady employment and a modest down payment. Recent medical bills had damaged her credit, however, and the lender's interest rate pushed the payment far beyond what she could afford. Dana removed the extended warranty. The number was still too high. She asked about a longer loan term. Still too high. She checked her banking app twice, called her sister, and quietly asked whether she could borrow another $500. The salesperson recalculated everything. It still did not work. Dana closed her purse and thanked him for trying. As she and Eli stood to leave, the boy looked up at her. "Can you still take the job at the other school?" Dana rested a hand against his shoulder. "I'll find another way." I watched them walk out, but I did not approach them. Their situation stayed in my head because the difference between Dana and Maria felt so sharp. Dana needed transportation to earn more money. Maria was worried about what strangers might think of the logo on the grill. On the Saturday of my appointment, the dealership called Dana again. A cheaper trade-in had arrived overnight. With the lower price and the extra $500 from her sister, the salesperson thought they might finally reach an affordable payment. Dana scheduled another visit that afternoon. The trade-in had higher mileage than she expected, and the lender's rate was still brutal. That was why she and Eli were sitting across the showroom when I arrived with Maria. I picked Maria up after her shift and told her we needed to make one stop. The moment we pulled into the Nissan dealership, she saw the Rogue through the showroom window. "You bought a car?" she asked. "I put a deposit on one." "For me?" I smiled. "Come look at it." The silver bow had been placed on the hood by the salesperson. I had not requested it, but I liked the way it made the surprise feel real. Maria walked around the Rogue once. Her face remained flat. "You chose it without me?" I researched it for months. It's certified, low mileage, and still under warranty. "Is this the highest trim?" "No, but it has nearly everything you said you needed." She looked through the driver's side window. "It's used. It's 2 years old. Why wouldn't we just lease something new?" "Because this one will be paid off today." Maria looked at me as though I had missed the point. What are people at work going to think when they see me in a used Nissan? "You'll own it outright." Paid off doesn't make it impressive. The sentence took the air out of the moment. I glanced at the bow, the polished hood, and the keys waiting inside the showroom. For 18 months, I had pictured Maria laughing, hugging me, or sitting behind the wheel with tears in her eyes. Instead, she was worried that the women at the cosmetics counter might not envy her. I still followed her into the finance office. Part of me believed the numbers would change her reaction. Once she saw there was no loan and no monthly payment, perhaps she would understand what I had done. The finance manager checked her identification and began explaining the documents. Her phone vibrated. She read the message and gave that small, private smile. "Who is it?" I asked. "It's nothing." The finance manager slid the first form toward her. That was when she said it. "Darren is buying me a Mercedes next week. You can keep your cheap Nissan." After I asked whether the transaction could be canceled, the finance manager left to find the general manager. Maria leaned closer to me. "What are you doing?" "Listening to you. I didn't tell you to cancel anything." "You just refused the car." "I said Darren is getting me something better." "Exactly." Her confidence slipped slightly when the general manager entered the office. He was a broad man with gray hair and reading glasses hanging from his collar. The finance manager explained the situation in a low voice. The general manager examined the preliminary paperwork. "No retail contract has been signed," he said. "No title application has been completed, so there isn't a finished sale to reverse. We can return the holding deposit or apply it to another transaction." I nodded toward the showroom. "Could the Rogue be sold to someone else if I still provide the money?" Maria stared at me. The manager looked at the cashier's check. "We can't replace the buyer's name on these forms. We would have to cancel this paperwork and create an entirely new cash sale. The new buyer would need identification and insurance. You would be listed as the third-party payer." "No loan?" "No loan. The buyer would own the vehicle once the paperwork and payment were completed." "Do it." Maria pushed her chair back. "James, what are you doing?" I looked directly at her. believing you. I picked up the envelope and walked across the showroom. Dana was still at the other desk. Her salesperson had a calculator beside him and a disappointed expression that told me the second deal had failed too. Eli was holding the same activity book from the week before. "Excuse me," I said. Dana looked up. I reminded her that I had been nearby during her previous appointment. She became guarded immediately, probably wondering why a stranger had been listening to her financial problems. "Do you still need a reliable car for that school position?" I asked. "Yes, but I'm not sure how that's your business." I pointed toward the Rogue. "I plan to buy that vehicle for someone who just refused it. The dealership says they can prepare a new cash sale in another buyer's name." Dana looked at the bow, then at Maria, who had followed me halfway across the showroom. "I don't understand." "If you're willing to accept it, I'll cover the full purchase price, taxes, and registration. The vehicle will be registered to you." Her face tightened with suspicion. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing. People don't give strangers cars for nothing. Today, one person might." Dana looked toward Maria again. "I don't want to be involved in somebody else's marriage." "You're not involved in our marriage. You're being offered a car. Those are two separate things." The general manager joined us and explained the transaction. He confirmed that Dana would not owe the dealership or me anything once the sale was completed. She still hesitated. Eli looked through the glass at the Rogue. "Would that car let you take the job at the other school?" Dana's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at me again. "Are you sure?" I glanced back at Maria. For 18 months, I had saved to give someone dependable transportation. That purpose had not changed, only the person had. "I'm sure." Maria grabbed my arm and pulled me several steps away. "You are humiliating me." "How?" "You're giving my car to a stranger." "You said it was cheap and told me to keep it." I was being sarcastic. "You named Darren and gave me a delivery date." "You're seriously making this a whole thing right now?" "You made it a whole thing when you told a room full of people that your ex was buying you a Mercedes." Maria marched back toward the finance desk and reached for the 2 Nissan key fobs. The finance manager moved them out of her reach. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said carefully. "Those keys still belong to the dealership. You haven't signed a contract or acquired any ownership interest in the vehicle." A couple sitting nearby had heard enough to understand what was happening. They exchanged a look. Nobody laughed, nobody applauded. The showroom simply grew quiet around Maria. That silence bothered her more than an argument would have. Dana provided her identification. Her sister helped her contact an insurance company and paid the first premium over the phone. The dealership canceled the preliminary documents with Maria's name and prepared a completely new buyer's order. Dana was listed as the registered buyer. I was listed as the third-party payer. I handed over the cashier's check. The final total was slightly higher because of a difference in registration fees, so I paid the remaining balance with my debit card. Dana signed the title and registration forms. Only after the manager confirmed that everything was complete did the finance manager slide the keys across the desk. Eli looked at his mother. "Does this mean you can take the new job?" Dana covered her mouth with one hand and nodded. The same Rogue that had embarrassed my wife had removed the one barrier standing between Dana and a better income. Maria left before Dana drove away. Because her dead sedan had already been sold for salvage, she had to order a rideshare from the dealership parking lot. I drove home alone. I expected to feel satisfied. Instead, my stomach felt hollow. For 18 months, I had imagined one version of that afternoon. I had seen Maria behind the wheel, smiling as I explained there would be no payment. That picture had collapsed in less than 10 minutes. Worse, her message from Darren suggested she had been planning another future while I saved for ours. Maria arrived home 40 minutes later. She found me sitting at the kitchen table. Her first words were not an apology. You made me look greedy in front of strangers. I didn't choose what you said. I only believed you. You spent all that money on someone you don't even know. I spent it on a reliable car. The car went to someone who needed it. That was supposed to be mine. You refused it. I told you Darren was buying me a Mercedes. Then transportation shouldn't be a problem. Maria's mouth tightened. You're going to feel ridiculous when it arrives. I nodded once. Then I suppose we'll both learn something. For the next several days, the Mercedes changed shape every time Maria discussed it. On Monday, Darren was purchasing it. On Tuesday, he was deciding between two colors. On Wednesday, the dealership supposedly needed extra paperwork. By Thursday, Darren had apparently found a better deal at another location. Maria continued taking calls in the laundry room. She asked to use my vehicle for work. I need it, I said. My shift starts before yours. You could arrange a ride. So could you. You're being petty. I thought the Mercedes was coming. Each time I mentioned it, her answer became less certain. Friday evening was supposed to be the delivery night. Maria, dressed for dinner, curled her hair and wore the black coat she saved for expensive restaurants. Darren is meeting me at the dealership, she said. A rideshare collected her shortly after 6. She returned almost 3 hours later without a car. There was a paperwork delay, she told me. Her makeup had smudged beneath one eye. I said nothing. Later, I heard her voice rising in the kitchen. She had Darren on speaker while scrolling through their old messages, apparently trying to prove what he had promised. You said you were getting me the car, she snapped. Darren's voice came through clearly. I said I'd help you lease one after you moved out. I never said I was buying you a Mercedes while you were still living with your husband. The speaker went silent. Maria snatched up the phone and removed him from speaker, but I had already heard enough. I remained in the hallway. From the pieces of their argument, the real offer became clear. Darren had sent her photographs from dealership websites. After Maria moved into her own apartment, he would contribute toward a lease down payment and cover the first 3 monthly payments. The lease would remain entirely in Maria's name. She would have to qualify for it, insure it, and make every later payment herself. He had not purchased a Mercedes. He had not reserved one. He had offered temporary help after she proved she was serious about leaving me. Maria had transformed that conditional offer into a guaranteed luxury gift and used it to humiliate me over a real, fully funded car. Their argument grew louder. You told me you two were already separated, Darren said. We are emotionally separated. You live in his house. Our house. You share bills with him. You were going to let him buy you a replacement car until that dealership mess. That wasn't what happened. Then what happened? Maria lowered her voice, but I no longer needed to hear every word. She had created different versions of her life for each of us. To me, Darren was an old boyfriend who occasionally sent harmless messages. To Darren, I was a temporary arrangement she was preparing to leave. Maria wanted him to believe she was available without giving up the security of our marriage. She demanded that he honor the Mercedes offer before she moved out. Darren refused. He said the car was supposed to prove they were building something together, but her hesitation showed she only wanted his money. The accusation was hypocritical. He had been using the Mercedes to pressure her into leaving. Still, his refusal ended the fantasy. Maria asked him to meet her the following day. He canceled. She called again. He stopped answering. The Mercedes did not disappear because of inventory, paperwork, or financing. It disappeared because it had never existed as a completed purchase. It was leverage dressed up as generosity. The next morning, Maria found me making coffee. Could the dealership undo the sale? No. Maybe we could offer that woman the cheaper car she was looking at. I stared at her. She has a completed sales contract, registration, and insurance. The Rogue belongs to her. You shouldn't have given away a nearly new vehicle. Yesterday it was a cheap Nissan. It was safe. It was fully equipped. It had a warranty. All of that was true at the dealership. It was better than having nothing. The car didn't improve overnight, Maria. Your alternatives disappeared. Her apology began that afternoon. Darren had manipulated her. The comparisons were supposed to motivate me. She had never physically cheated. I should have confronted her earlier. Giving the car away had been an irresponsible emotional reaction. I let her finish every defense. Then I asked one question. If Darren had handed you those Mercedes keys last night, would you still be apologizing to me? Maria looked down at the floor. Her silence told me everything. The apology was not about what she had done. It was about what she had lost. I spent the weekend organizing practical matters. I copied our bank statements, tax documents, insurance records, utility bills, and household expenses. I left every dollar in our shared accounts untouched. I redirected my future paychecks to a new individual account and documented the shared balance on the date of the change. I rented a month-to-month furnished apartment near the warehouse. I was not trying to punish Maria financially. I was removing myself from a marriage where I had become the backup plan. On Sunday evening, I placed a folder on the kitchen table. Maria looked at it hopefully. Is that from the dealership? No. Inside were copies of our financial records and a breakdown of the bills we would need to manage while we separated. I'm moving out this week, I said. Maria began crying. I chose you, James. You kept me. That isn't the same as choosing me. Darren was never competing with you. I'm not interested in competing with a man who was never actually in the race. You're ending our marriage over one sentence? The sentence lasted a few seconds. The contempt behind it lasted more than a year. She shook her head. You're exaggerating. You compared my real income to his online photographs. You compared my completed sacrifice to his conditional promise. You let another man set terms for your future while expecting me to stay here in case he failed. Maria wiped her face. That isn't fair. You wanted me dependable enough to catch you, but not valuable enough to respect. She pulled out her phone. I'll block him. Look. She deleted Darren's contact and offered to show me their entire message history. I pushed the phone back toward her. The messages aren't the central issue anymore. What else do you want me to do? You want to repair this marriage because Darren withdrew the Mercedes. That's not true. Would we be having this conversation if he had arrived Friday night? Again, she had no answer. She looked toward the folder. Are you really ending everything over a Nissan? The car isn't why I'm leaving. It's just where you finally said the quiet part, where other people could hear it. For once, Maria could not redirect the conversation toward Darren, the dealership, money, or my reaction. She had believed she controlled two futures. In one, she kept a stable husband who paid bills, solved problems, and absorbed every comparison. In the other, Darren delivered the luxury life she believed she deserved. Neither future was real. She rejected the Nissan before it became hers. Darren withdrew a Mercedes he had never purchased. I left because I refused to remain the fallback between her fantasies and disappointments. 3 weeks later, the Nissan salesperson called me. Dana had left a sealed thank you card at the dealership and given him permission to forward it. Her note said she had accepted the relief kitchen manager position and was now traveling between both schools. The increased income meant she no longer needed to work weekend catering shifts. Inside the card was a photograph of Eli sitting in the Rogue's back seat, holding the same activity book he had carried during Dana's first dealership visit. Maria continued sending messages about counseling and starting over. I replied only when necessary to handle shared expenses and separation arrangements. There was no second confrontation. The important one had already happened. For more than a year, I let Maria measure my life against another man's promises. I thought staying quiet protected our marriage, but my silence gave her room to mistake patience for weakness. The Nissan was never luxurious, yet it was dependable, fully paid for, and real. By the end of that week, I understood those qualities mattered in people too. If this story kept you listening, tap like and subscribe for more stories where quiet choices reveal exactly who people have become.